All right, thank you all for making it out. It's great to have a packed house. This is our second AAC lecture of the year. Please mark your calendars for next week. It's a bit of an oddball. It is affiliated with the AIA convention, which this year is the Fall Regional Convention, which will be held in Des Moines. And our AAC sponsors and the school will be supporting the Law Dahlman lecture. So please mark that in your calendar. There's a full slate of lectures available for all architecture students and affiliated students. I would highly encourage, if you can make them, please attend. So please mark calendars for that. And then we have another lecture later in the semester on December 2nd by Dan Winger. So mark your calendars for that as well. Again, we'd like to greatly thank the alumni who've helped sponsor tonight's event and all other lectures, including the upcoming spring lecture series. So we are in great debt and gratitude to those alumni who make these events possible. Tonight we have a very special guest speaker, and I will turn the reins over to Tom Leslie to introduce him.
Thank you, James. And it's a truly great pleasure to be asked to introduce tonight's speaker. The critic Helen Wendler points out that, quote, "a vacant stretch of grass becomes humanly important when one reads the sign, Gettysburg." Focusing on the lawn itself isn't the point, of course. It's the aura, the lived experience of that piece of grass and what happened there to human beings 150 years ago that resonates with our emotions and our spirit. The writing of tonight's guest, Juhani Pallasmaa, is quite like that sign. His written work, especially since his extraordinary 1996 book, The Eyes of the Skin, has urged us to retake and defend, in his words, the authenticity of human experience against the forces of commodity, spectacle, and photography and media. He argues for the meaningfulness of experience, the value of craft, and the inherent and deep pleasure in attention on the parts of both designer and user. He is perhaps our field's greatest proponent of mindfulness. Juhani Pallasmaa was born in 1936 outside of Helsinki, but he recalls his wartime experience on a family farm in rural Finland as a formative experience in his interest in space and building. Beginning in the 1960s, he practiced as an architect and designer, completing projects including the renovation of the Old Market Hall in Helsinki, the Finnish Institute in Paris, and the entry plaza to the Cranbrook Academy of Art in Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. He collaborated with Stephen Hull on the design and realization of Kiasma, the Museum of Contemporary Art in central Helsinki, and he was the lead designer on the Kamppi Center, the city's new commercial and transit center, in 2006. He's taught for many years at the Helsinki Institute of Technology and was dean for 7 years there. He's held visiting positions throughout the world, including Washington University in St. Louis, the University of Virginia, Yale, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's been honored with the International Union of Architects Jean Schumi Prize for Architectural Criticism, the Arnold W. Bruner Memorial Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and an honorary fellowship from the American Institute of Architects. Pallasmaa is the author and editor of numerous books, including The Embodied Image in 2011, The Thinking Hand in 2009, 2 collected volumes of essays called Encounters, books on Alvar Aalto, his own work, Sensuous Minimalism, The Architecture of Image, and of course, The Eyes of the Skin. His current work on atmospheres is scheduled for publication later this year. We were fortunate to have him conduct a graduate seminar yesterday based on essays from this new work. On a personal note, I was delighted to be Juhani's neighbor 2 years ago when we worked out of adjoining studios at the American Academy in Rome. The privilege of seeing Roman monuments and Italian landscapes in his company was profound and constantly enlightening. He became a good friend and mentor to all of us, and the projects that our group did that year all bear the hallmark of his conversations. In addition to being a gifted writer, an insightful critic, and a rigorous theorist, Juhani is an incredibly generous scholar, evidenced by his near constant global travel and the energy that he's brought to schools, symposia, and workshops throughout the world. It's been an honor and a rare privilege to introduce him to Iowa, and I'm very happy to introduce him to you all tonight. Please join me in welcoming Juhani Pallasmaa to Iowa State.
Nowadays I rarely speak on my design work, but I sent maybe about 6 or 7 topics. From which to choose, and Tom and some others chose this title. I could have sent 400 lecture topics because I have written 400 essays. I usually tell my students that I am not going to try to teach you what architecture is, but I can set an example how to live your life as an architect. And that's what I'm trying to do tonight also. The French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, probably my favorite philosophical writer, writes, "How would the painter or poet express anything other than his encounter with the world?" Well, I would ask accordingly, how would an architect do otherwise? At least for me, this is exactly what motivates me to work as an architect, is to elaborate on my encounter with the world and somehow try to understand what that encounter means. Ludwig Wittgenstein, another philosopher who has been important to architects, partly because he designed a house for his sister. So he's a philosopher who also worked as an architect. He writes in one of his notes, "Working in philosophy, like work in architecture in many respects, is really more a working on oneself, on one's own interpretation, on one's way of seeing things." For me, this is also quite fundamental. When we work on a creative project, we might be a bit misguided to think that we are working only on that very object or project. We are actually working on ourselves, on our self-understanding. One of my favorite writers is the Argentine poet Jorge Luis Borges. In the epilogue for the collection of poems, The Maker, he has this sentence: "A man sets himself the task of portraying the world. Over the years, he fills a given surface with images of provinces and kingdoms, mountains, bays, ships, islands, fish, rooms, instruments, heavenly bodies, horses, and people. Shortly before he dies, he discovers that this patient labyrinth of lines is a drawing of his own face." Well, this quote underlines the fact that our own image and our own being and life are absolutely mixed with our work, and this is something we better acknowledge and know rather than this, self-image creeping into the work unnoticed. As became clear after Tom's introduction, I have written quite a number of books. I think the count at the moment is 54. But beyond my work as a writer, I have always been designing all kinds of things, from letters to, letters for printing, to posters, to graphic work, to furniture products, architecture, urban projects, etc. And for me, it has always been impossible to understand boundaries, and this is due to my childhood at my farmer grandfather's farm, where I never heard anyone ask another person, can you do this? It was naturally assumed that everyone can do what is needed in life. And I learned that, and I have never feared a new, challenge of any kind. Actually, I'm most excited about tasks which I have never thought about. I'm going to say another general observation. I have become suspicious of whether humanity or culture progresses. I doubt it. Wave motion movement in water is illusory. We know from elementary physics books that waves, the waves are grounded on circular motions of water particles. They do just this movement, all of them, every single particle. There's no movement. The movement is illusory. And I think in the same way, in human culture, as individuals, we do our own circles, keep doing our own circles, but there is the illusion of huge progress. I think that's an illusion. At least I identify myself doing my little circle. Perhaps through age, the circles have become a bit larger in radius, but still it's a circular movement coming back to the same questions and issues all the time. Before I show my examples of my work, I give you a couple of more ideas. These are quotes from one of my favorite writers, Joseph Brodsky, the Russian poet who immigrated to the United States. He writes, "Seen from the outside, creativity is the object of fascination and envy. Seen from within, it is an unending exercise in uncertainty and a tremendous school for insecurity." I would say architecture, even more, is a tremendous school for insecurity. Then, in another context, he writes, "Poetry is a tremendous school of insecurity and uncertainty. You never know whether what you've done is any good, still less whether you'll be able to do anything good tomorrow. If this doesn't destroy you, insecurity and uncertainty at the end become your intimate friends, and you almost attribute to them an intelligence of their own." At the age of 79 now, I have become very good friends with insecurity and uncertainty, and I acknowledge their intelligence. He also has, in one of his essays, a stunning line, "Uncertainty, you see, is the mother of beauty." I don't go into explaining it, but there's a lot to think about in that argument. In the title image, I had entitled my lecture 12 themes. These are the 12 themes I'm going to speak about: continuous line, penetration, circle or arc, joint, touch, matter, color, scale, light, landscape, stairway, column, and time. This probably sounds or looks like a collection of words from a madman, but I hope that it will be clear in an hour why I have chosen those subtitles. The image here is a piece of wood sculpture about my own height as a symbol of my one-man exhibition at the Venice Biennale in 1991, made of plywood. Continuous line. Since my school years, I have admired the capacity of certain artists, like especially Henri Matisse, to create an image of a human body with sometimes one single continuous line. In my own work, I often start, when I start seeking for the idea, I try the idea of continuous line. This is a plywood and carbon fiber steel, spring steel chair prototype. On the left, a logotype for a printing company, and then a graphic group of which I was member, G4, then letters which have this continuous line quality, further examples of furniture prototypes with the idea of continuous line, and this one, a adjustable chaise longue which revolves around one single axis, made of the same material, laminated plywood and carbon fiber. I often, when we cut a hole through any surface, like or a paper, the hole somehow creates an eye or a facial image, so that the penetration of a surface creates a kind of a mask. And for me, all facades are masks. The very first mask-like thing that I designed is on the left-hand side, which is my father's grave from 1966. My father was an atheist, whereas many other members of the family had religious beliefs. So I made my father's grave marker as an absent cross in order to address both attitudes to religion, denying it and having faith in it. Many of you might relate this image with Tadao Ando's Church of Light in Japan. Tadao designed his church 30 years later than I did this, Tadao being my friend though. These are two examples of doors with holes in them for the purpose of creating a kind of an quiet invitation and sense of curiosity, a cafe in Helsinki and then the Finnish Cultural Institute in Paris, opposite the Sorbonne University. Another exercise in form combining two processes, cutting through and then bending. Circle comes up in my designs often. I would say because circle is such a powerful image and it has a tendency to complete itself. So half a circle is in a way a full circle, even a quarter circle is a full circle. And I often try what comes out of this incomplete completeness of a intersected circle. This is a extension to a courthouse in eastern Finland, where the rectangular building back there is the original courthouse designed by the Finnish architect Viljo Revel, who was the architect for the Toronto Town Hall. And mine is a semicircular building with rainbow colors running around the building to give a specific identity to each point on the circumference. Another project, a house and studio for a designer couple, which was never built. This is one of my favorite projects. I don't go into floor plans at all. And this is the arrival plaza at the Cranbrook Academy in Bloomfield Hills, which ended up becoming a astronomical instrument, one of the most precise ever constructed. I didn't have astronomy at all in my mind when I started with this, but appropriately it's generated by circles because the circles come from the revolutions of planets. But I will show this project in detail in the very end because it's not so far from here. This is an image of the completed project. Half circles in smaller scale. The arc is so inviting. This is a house and sauna for a Finnish art collector, which is located on a hillside. This is lake below, and then the slopes up. The villa sort of steps out from the slope, following the lake and the revolution of the sun, whereas the sauna does the opposite gesture of pushing its head into the terrain for a reason or in search of privacy. This is the house itself, the arcs of the house and the sauna. This is from the inside before the furniture had been moved in. And the sauna, as you know, is kind of a meditation place. And I placed the sauna very carefully so that when you sit on the platform of the sauna here on the right-hand side, you have a horizontal, narrow window, like a line in front of you, and your eye is directed exactly to this escape point on the opposite shore for the purpose that you can meditate fully only when your eyes are focused on infinity. I use the same psychological idea in the fireplace. The fireplace pushes out of the house, and the top, okay, thank you, and the back wall in the fireplace is glass for the purpose that you can shift your focus from the fire nearby to the landscape behind. And another reason, still being perhaps a more important one, that in the dark winter night, when you are having a fire in your fireplace, the light of the fire is reflected in the snow-covered trees, and the fire of your fireplace becomes a full circle, like a campfire. A campfire has such a very profound psychological impact. There are theories, even Vitruvius suggests that our language, the origin of language, is related with the invention of taming of fire. Another project which Tom mentioned, the Communications and Shopping Commercial Center in Helsinki, where I have a series of ovals and circles in the central space. Joint is one of the ABCs in architecture. I practice joints as sort of sculptural objects, and here is an example of a real architectural joint for a industrial housing system or holiday housing, which was conceived in 1968. And here is the joint which permits connection of horizontal and vertical elements, and then adjustment of the foundation part, both horizontally and vertically, to cope with lack of precision in the concrete work. You might be a bit surprised to know that this is a temporary summer exhibition pavilion built next to Alvar Aalto's legendary Villa Mairea. It was built and taken down in about 2 months. This is, here are parts of the components of the building brought from the factory, and the construction advances without any scaffolding. The maximum weight was set at 50 kilos because 2 men can lift easily a 50-kilo element, which is, has a factory finish without scratching it and destroying it. Here you see the joint element, which is, there is only one single joint in the entire system. This derives from a traditional Japanese wood joint, which locks like this, and then a wooden pin between the two parts. Here it was transferred to aluminum. And then the foundation, the time when this was conceived in 1968 was a time of strong pacifistic movement in Europe, and we got the idea that we could perhaps use army anti-tank bazooka shots for peaceful purposes, and we made experiments which worked beautifully. Shooting the bazooka shot vertically into the ground creates 10,000 degree temperature, that melts everything, which then immediately hardens, and you have a ceramic tube which goes exactly as deep as it needs to go, because in a clay it goes rather deep, and other kinds of sand, for instance, it doesn't need to be that deep for structural purposes. So, and most importantly, you can have the foundations made without at all excavating and damaging the site. Then we also, this was the first time that heating foil was used in my country. Already then, I became to be interested in the tactile qualities, and in my later work you always see details that somehow invite the tactile sense. Our own dining table, the joint looks very simple, but it's extremely difficult to make because there has to be a semicircular indentation at each unit in order to the angle to disappear. The other image is the urn of my architect brother-in-law, who was a minimalist, and I thought it was appropriate to bury him in an urn that doesn't reveal a single joint. Whenever you begin to articulate on the joining of vertical and horizontal, a kind of a classical column appears, which suggests that the classical column is not at all, or originally, a stylistic invention. It just articulates human perception and thinking about the joining of two directions and forces. Touch became important for me fairly early on, and I think one of the problems in today's architecture, maybe the architecture of the last 50 years, is that the tactile invitation is very weak or non-existent altogether. Merleau-Ponty has a beautiful line where he writes, "With vision we touch the sun and the stars." I think architecture can express or invite touching through vision, and through that invitation, architecture is made pleasurable and inviting and also sensuous. I would suggest that there is always in good architecture an erotic element. The erotic element comes from the fact that all spaces are embraces. They are embraces of the mother, but also embraces of the lover in psychoanalytical terms. So these are door pulls which I have molded in clay and then cast in bronze. For me, the door handle is the handshake of the building. That's the most intimate contact with a building. And I have always designed a special handshake for each one of my buildings. In 1991, I had my own personal exhibition at the Venice Biennale, and for that exhibition I made I think 3 dozen or 30 variations on the door handle, particularly examples or exercises in architectural courtesy. A door handle usually just, it just simply is there fixed to the door, but the door handle can also make a little courteous gesture to the approaching hand and invite the touch of the hand. And these are all exercises with that tactility of the hand. And since then I have used often the word architectural courtesy. I must say that probably due to regulations here in the United States, in American buildings, I very rarely find that architectural courtesy in that scale. For instance, handrails are too thick for the hand. It's always a pleasure when the handrail is exactly measured for the touch, so that you understand the causal relationship. Here, the handrail expresses not only the touch but also the body movement when you descend or ascend the stair. One aspect of tactility is materiality. The image on the left-hand side is an artist's summer studio built of materials picked up from the site, and the right-hand side is our own family kitchen with materials and textures to invite tactile experience. Another example of resonance with movement, the stair on the top, at the top, the lower stair expresses first the fact that when you come down from a stair, you want to stop or slow down to see the space where you are which you are entering, and then the forms here also suggest the directions to which you might go. The other image is an exhibition of animal architecture, which I designed 25 years ago, I guess, where I covered the floors of the museum with 4 inches of sand, with the idea that our muscular memory is activated when we walk on sand, and it is an archaic memory which carries us away from the reality of that architectural space. And that strategy seemed to work very well indeed. In the Paris Institute, on the left, you walk across from the main door. You walk across a granite foyer floor, and then you enter the inner spaces through a 3-story high, almost like a drum-like space on stairs and stairways and ramps, which are made so that the sound of your footsteps echoes back and forth in the vertical space. The other image is from the IBM building in Moscow, next to the Kremlin, where I have a light court and then steel and wood bridges crossing that light court in various directions for the purpose of again creating sounds that echo in the space, which make you bodily and in terms of perception associate and identify yourself with the space. For this, I might tell here, for this very space I received 1995 architecture prize of the Russian Federation from President Yeltsin at the Kremlin, and the prize was a shoebox full of money. Yes, and we used to have that shoebox at home, and whenever I or my wife went abroad, and one would say, "Have you got currency?" The other one would say, "I went to the Yeltsin box already." Another example of tactile invitation, a pedestrian bridge and light traffic bridge in an ecological park, which was inspired by a traditional peasant eel trap. A colonnade of 9 water columns in the center of a shopping mall where water falls down very quickly very slowly on the surfaces, and here I intended that to be as a calming experience in the middle of the madness of shopping. Matter color, this is an early project of mine when I was not very interested about touch. This is the first plastic and steel house in Finland, and I admired the French 2CV car, which often were also very colorful, and I admired them being parked in the street, and I thought that why can't a house be like a French colorful 2CV car parked on its site. At the same time, I designed this summer house for a famous Finnish engineer of materials which were picked directly from the site. So the change in design approach was quite decisive. Somewhat later, I made exhibitions of Finnish use of wood in Finnish culture, from peasant objects and tools to contemporary art. And here the psychological device which worked very well was that none of the objects were identified with texts in the exhibition itself, which resulted in the visitors looking at the objects with innocent child's eye, not knowing whether they were looking at a contemporary piece of art or a farmer's tool or farming device 200 years old. And there were several persons when I dropped into the exhibition who would come, with tears in their eyes to thank me for those memories that came through. The Sami Lap Museum in Lapland, for which I worked seven years and spent quite a lot of time with the reindeer herders in Lapland, close to the Arctic Ocean. And Tom mentioned the transportation and shopping center in Helsinki, for which a number of materials were developed. This is a Marimekko shop, which doesn't exist anymore. And a courtyard in Helsinki, in the very center of Helsinki, which was an unused courtyard, and I turned it into a courtyard for restaurants. And since it's a very deep 8-floor high space with very little light, I worked with a Finnish painter to create an illusion of being in a southern town, maybe a Mediterranean town, or I was more specifically thinking of Mexican villages, and sort of a village, how do you call it, well, is my direct tribute to Luis Barragan, who I think is one of the finest architects of all time. Another experiment, an exhibition of sculpture, for which I made watercolor paintings which were 15 meters wide, 4.5 meters tall. The way they were made, there is a wooden frame, textile cloth was suspended, and then the textile was sprayed with water so that it was all wet, and then amounts of color were taken with rags and squeezed down the wet surface. So gravity created the quite beautiful, ambiguous spaces. Another material experiment, snow. There was an international exhibition of snow sculptures in northern Finland, where the organizers invited artist-architect pairs to work on projects. I was paired with the famous British sculptor lady, Rachel Whiteread. And as both she and I were engaged with images of stairs at that time, we decided to make our shared project of a stair. And we took the actual stair in her East London 2-story studio and turned the stair in, sideways position, and then that was made of pure white snow, compacted so that it looks like white marble. And no one could tell that it's an ordinary stair from London, because the brain could not anymore understand the realist stair. The image on the right is how it looked. I have turned the slide 90 degrees to show that it is actually almost exactly the stair in her London studio. Another material experiment, an art museum in Lapland, for which I wanted to build a symbol or symbolization which would turn the industrial brick building, very coarse building, into a cultural building. I also wanted to make a barrier when people, perhaps disturbed by seeing modern art, walk into the street, they are not hit by a car. This is the museum itself, and there is in that curtain covered box, there is a concert hall inside. In this project, I wanted to avoid the normal situation where renovation kills completely the depth of time and patina of use. I did not permit the cleaning ladies to even wipe off the industrial dust from the old building in order to maintain that dialogue between the old and the new. This is the concert hall, where the idea of these colored recesses is that they are acoustically necessary, but the psychological idea is that when you come to a concert a few minutes before the music begins, there is a little awkward moment, where to look and what to think and what to feel. So I felt that having these colored boxes on the two sides, they would give a peripheral massage to your vision and somehow activate your senses. And then when the music starts, the lights that light the colors fade away, and you are energetically prepared to listen to the first note of music. If you have sharp eyes, you might see that there are glass shelves both horizontally and vertically, because one of the perhaps the most important aspect in acoustics of a concert hall is that the musicians receive enough reflection from the hall in order to hear what they are playing, and also hear the musician friends playing. And so often in acoustic design, that aspect, fundamental aspect, is forgotten. Well, in this one I worked in close collaboration with the musicians and the very famous, internationally famous conductor, John Sturgårds, who has also conducted many famous American symphony orchestras. Scale is important in architecture. This is the smallest design project of mine, a gold coin. The diameter is 18 millimeters. And the original which I made was in scale 10 to 1, not 1 to 10, which is normal in architectural practice. And the opposite end of the scale, a power plant where the glass chimney is 230 meters tall. I worked 3 or 4 years on a banking block in the center of Helsinki, and at the same time, when working with that huge block, I designed a Marimekko shop in the same block and dealt with the touch of the 2 fingers. And I think that's one of the most magical aspects of architecture, is to be able to span your interest and effort between the two scales. This is the Campi Center, and fireplace tools for our own fireplace. I'm just juxtaposing them to suggest, at least to me, that they are both architectural projects, and in some way the smaller one is much more difficult because you have so few choices from which to choose. This is the banking block, and at the same time I designed the telephone booth system for Helsinki city, which they are all gone now because of mobile phones. Another tiny project, which is an ice cream kiosk by the shore next to where I live. And I show this just to tell you that when I started this project, I have done other street furniture projects for Helsinki city. The officials have always told me to design vandal-proof, and I have said I'm not going to do it. If you design and build something vandal-proof, it is an invitation to the tough guys to try whether they can break it. But if you do things delicately, courteously, no one will destroy them. This is the only structure in the harbor area which has never had graffiti or no violence, ever, because everyone understands that it can be easily broken. Whenever I have a moment free time, I do an object, or like these are my gifts to my wife. When I was a student, I made my living as a graphic designer, and I also printed most of these by silkscreen. And I show these just to suggest to the students that don't wait perhaps 20 years for the big commission to come. Begin to see architecture in tiny little things around you, and you can start your architectural practice tomorrow without any commission. Light is, of course, essential. in architecture, but when I was young, for me light was rather a quantitative thing, but then eventually it has become increasingly qualitative, and I now feel that light is the most sublime and sensual of all architectural means. The left-hand side image is the Stephen Hall's Chiasma Museum at the back, and then my lights for the urban square. And the other image is my own library lights. Two other light designs for my own office. Landscape is important in architecture. This image here on the right is a painter's summer studio, and my sketch of the site in the colors of fall, late fall, when everything seems to be on fire, and sketches of my travels around the world. I just show these as a suggestion to students that go back to drawing. Landscapes, buildings in landscapes. The left-hand side image is the first experimental construction of the Moduli 225 system. The Finnish mentality is to hide your buildings in the forest, so we do not make a clearing on which we erect the building. We try to put the building in a way that, if possible, no trees will be cut. These are two images of the Sami Lap Museum, where the building is broken into a kind of a village-like image, and the roof repeats the shape of snow drifts, and bring the eaves line so low as possible to bring it to the scale of the landscape. This little tea house was designed and built for one of the directors of Nokia, when Nokia was still a leading company in mobile phones. The normal reading of landscape is a horizontal pan. This building forces your perception of the landscape into a vertical pan, which makes you aware of the sky. This is actually exactly the same strategy that Louis Kahn has at the Salk Institute, where sky becomes the ceiling or roof. Another tiny landscape, a family grave. My favorite commissions have always been related with burials. Not that I would have, hopefully, not a morbid attitude or mentality. It's just that you are designing for a person who is not here anymore to approve or reject the project. So your empathy has to be heightened in those cases. This is on the right, the facade of the Finnish Institute in France, and then a poster I designed for a textile designer artist, and both show horizontal lines like that. And I was myself wondering why I like this repetitious move so much. I think these are both landscapes. These are both my way of architectural landscape painting. Stairway is important in architecture. It's one of the, perhaps besides the door, the stairway is the one aspect that brings you in most direct bodily connection with the building. I exercise stairs by making objects of stairs, which are like flattened stairways or flattened buildings with a little bit of Escher in them. This is a man-hide, male and female stair. The right-hand stair here is my gift to my brother, Glenn Murcutt, the Australian architect. Column, I already showed this image. Here is a colonnade to the courtyard, which I showed earlier. And then the colonnade of the Cranbrook project, which I show as the last project time. We architects do not always understand that we human beings, we dwell in time as much as in space. And I think good architecture evokes the experience of deep time. When I was at Cranbrook, invited by the lady president of the academy to review architectural projects there, and we were having dinner late at night, at midnight, she pointed out to me that there is a new road from Detroit to the Cranbrook compound, which meets the street in an awkward T intersection. This is Eliel Saarinen's art museum, and this is Eliel Saarinen's Institute of Science, which was expanded by Stephen Hall. And the lady asked me, could I turn this into a place? I said, yes, I'm leaving tomorrow at 9 o'clock from Detroit airport, but if we meet at 6 o'clock in the morning, I'll show you a project. And I did show her a project which turned, as built, turned into the right-hand side image. During that night, I was thinking of the axes and the colonnades and arcades and circles and all of those at the academy designed by my countryman. And this was the project that I presented to her in the morning, and she immediately liked it, and we went to execute the entry plaza. During the night, she had explained the place to me and said, you come to a T intersection, and then you turn to the right to the art museum, and then you turn to the left to the Institute of Science. And she made these curved gestures in the air. I made two hand gestures, two curves, the colonnade that is in dialogue with the colonnade of the art museum, and the bronze wall that is in dialogue with the rectangular Institute of Science building. Then, while working on further with the project, I found strange singular stones in the stone walls of Cranbrook, and I asked the director of the Institute of Science what might be, where would these stones have come? And he showed me the glacial map of America, which is on the right-hand side, which shows that mile-thick immense mass of ice had stopped exactly where I was working. And these stones are samples that the glacier had brought from Canada. And I selected 6 of them, and the geology experts identified from where they have come from, north of Cranbrook all the way to Canada, and the 6 columns were made of those. Then, as you may see, there is a lens on top of the second column, and that lens casts the sunlight as a 30 millimeter extremely bright spot on the ground. And you might know that the noon shadow through the year, it's not a straight line that would, grow and then become shorter again. It makes a loop. And it makes a loop because the shadow is a consequence of 3 movements. Earth moving around its axis, Earth moving around Sun, and then the axis of the Earth doing this movement. And the combination of the 3 movements is so complex that the pattern never repeats. But with Helsinki University astronomy department, at the department with the fine computers, we could run time hundreds of thousands of years back and forth and see how this analemma figure changed. And the analemma figures are used to read time really precisely. The center analemma here is for year 2000, and that is made of stainless steel. This analemma, which is a single loop, like a water drop, existed in 93,000 BC, and in 69,405 AD, the analemma will be completely asymmetrical. And these are knobs for each year of the day. On this given day, the 30 millimeter image of the light will strike the spot exactly. These are made of stainless steel. The analemma points of past in lead, and the analemma points of future in brass. And the idea being that in the year 69,405 AD, someone, if there still is someone, can polish the brass spots and see whether our clock is on time. My astronomer friends convinced me that it will be on time. Then, in order to locate the various, actually all the planets or celestial phenomena that we see by naked eye, we developed star maps at the University of Helsinki. The top image is how the curved wall units looked when they were taken away from the mold, and I had tears in my eyes because I felt that the whole job was spoiled because the brass surface was so uneven. But then when the star maps were engraved, I realized that I had been given another gift. The bronze looked like the depth of the universe. Then one more problem existed. In the middle of the project, there is a manhole. And whereas this shape, I remember, is the background of Christ in medieval representations. It's called Vesaikapiske. And I contacted the academy and said, it's an unbearable thought that there is a manhole on the Vesaika Pisces. Could you move it? And they said, yes, it costs another $1.5 million. So I had to abandon the idea. I remembered the painting by Hieronymus Bosch in the Prado Museum, where in this corner there is a strange manhole, and look at the events that are taking place around that manhole. So I suggested to the Academy that we engrave that detail of Hieronymus Bosch on the manhole cover to remind the observers that hell is down there. But the Prado Museum did not permit us to use a Hieronymus Bosch image on a manhole cover. So what I did next, I called another astronomer and asked him to calculate exactly how long would be a plumb line through that manhole cover, through the Earth, and where exactly it would re-emerge on the other side of the Earth, and then how far away from the center of the Earth that plumb line would pass by the center, because Earth, as you know, is not circular, it's flattened because of its revolving movement. Only plumb lines from the poles that go through the center point. All other plumb lines pass at a certain distance. And this is the fax, that was fax time. I received from my astronomer friend, that's first in Finnish, hello, would this do? And the text is, the plumb line extending down from this point will pass the center of the Earth at a distance of 21.3 kilometers. The line will emerge from the surface of the Indian Ocean about halfway between Kerguelen Island and Perth, Australia, 12,737 kilometers below this point. And this text was engraved on the manhole cover, and it works psychologically very effectively. I have watched people who come to the casually on the step on the manhole cover and start to read the text, but at the moment they understand the message, they immediately step away. Well, this was my lecture. I just want to say that even today, I do not understand at all how a piece of design which started from two hand gestures of a lady, which I measured through Pythagorean harmonic system based on my own height, ends up being an astronomical instrument. Probably the most precise one ever constructed, which doesn't have mobile parts. There's something for every one of us to think. Thank you.
Take some questions?
Surely.
Well, thank you so much, Juhani. We'll never look at manhole covers the same way again, I'm sure. We do have time for a few questions. In fact, I can't actually see. Yeah.
In your book, The Eye of the Ski, you mentioned about a concern about modern architecture being contemplated as a hegemony of the eye. So in this sense, I would like to know for you, how can we contemplate or produce, or Because you mentioned about the tactile experience,
Yes.
how much as important of appreciating architecture in form, but I would like to know how can smell be involved in the same process?
Well, I have come to the conclusion that the most important dimension, experiential dimension in architecture is our own existential experience. We sense ourselves in the world as articulated by architecture. That happens in normal situations, but it is of course enhanced when we are in a masterpiece. And that existential experience is not a visual observation, it's a full embodied image or sensation in which all the sense modalities are united. And here I want to emphasize that we do not only have the 5 Aristotelian senses, we have more senses. Steinerian philosophy deals with 12 senses. I have suggested in some of my essays that our atmospheric sense is the 6th sense, or should be named the 6th sense. I think the way to, at least for me, the way to get around my own, how would I say, almost violent visuality of the youth has been to become conscious of my body, to somehow begin to experience things, spaces, for instance, through one's body and intestines. I can't say more. Probably there could be a series of exercises in an architecture school which widen our sense of ourselves in space and place, but everyone can do it in one's personal life. I think it's just also a matter of how would I say, custom. Take the custom of touching things, and then you realize that actually the skin sees much better than, more precisely than the eye. And once you begin to give priority to the touch, I think the dominance of vision is somewhat relieved.
I'm sorry, I have another question. I think something that is happening now in the way we do architecture is that technologies are evolving the way we create architecture. So, for instance, we use programs and different kinds of stuff, which I think personally block the way we design architecture, because doing this kind of stuff digitally block our senses to create architecture. Do you think any way to introduce like sense of notion or senses into these new technologies that have been evolving for society?
I am critical of the new technologies, not the technologies themselves, but the constant misuse of technologies. For instance, the use of computer to replace human imagination. Once we have developed our capacity of imagination, the computer probably is entirely benevolent. But if we begin to imagine through the computer, we are lost. So everything has its place and its time, and I think computers should not be introduced too early in teaching architectural students. I have done quite a lot of studies related with neurology, and I'm in collaborating with some very fine neurologists, and and they completely agree with my point. The most important first step in learning is to connect the mind, the eye, and the hand, so that that connection becomes completely automatic and natural.
Other questions?
Yes?
You made a strong comment in the beginning of your lecture about how you believe that culture might not progress but continuously revolutionize.
Yes.
And that correlates a lot to your work. But,
Yes.
do you also believe that within each revolution, the center axis can forward or progress to another direction? And in that sense, each revolution will move from its origin. So as a conclusion, it would be saying that we do actually forward as culture.
Well, what I said and what I showed was just a metaphor. So I'm not wanting my statement to be a scientific argument. I just think that it's also helpful to become a little bit modest as a culture and accept the possibility that we are not progressing at all. When you take a look at a cave painting, for instance, you cannot see any progress from that wonderful depiction of life, in the Lascaux caves, for instance, in comparison to today's art. If possible, the Lascaux paintings or anywhere else in the world, or early Stone Age paintings, they are more vivid than anything we can do.
There are waves, and then there are tides. There may be two very different things, right? Other questions?
Altogether, I would want to repeat that I'm not trying to convey truths. I'm in a scientific manner. I'm trying to convey personal experiences that I have very strongly lived through, and I believe there is a truth value also in something that we as individuals strongly experience. It's not often accepted as a scientific method. We all know that first-person reports are not usually accepted as scientific method, but there are important, extremely important areas of life, like the whole phenomenon of art, which can only be approached from first-person perspective. So I suggest we better alter our definition of what science is and what is scientific.
Well, Juhani, I want to thank you so much for coming to visit us and lecturing to us, and your time with us in seminar yesterday. It's been, as always, an inspiring couple of days, and we were very grateful for you to stop off. I know you're going from, as is typical for you, you're going from Oregon to Buffalo. And fortunately, we're on the flight path between the two. So thank you very much, and thank you all for coming.